How many of you have heard or read the book, The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot? Maybe half a dozen. Oh, I recommend this to all of you to read. The Holographic Universe was first released as a hardcover by HarperCollins in 1991. Around the same time, I spoke at a Midwest conference along with human abduction researcher Bud Hopkins. The new book by a young man only 38 years old, and its mind-blowing hypothesis that our universe was being projected by something else, maybe from another dimension, was the topic of many discussions at that 1991 conference. After the conference, Bud and I had the same airline flight back east to New York and Philadelphia, where I lived at the time. Bud and I sat next to each other to talk about some new abduction cases, and he surprised me when he said, quote, "I'll tell you something confidentially. Michael Talbot has been one of my UFO abduction cases, but he doesn't know anyone, he has not told anyone, and he does not want anyone to know that because he's afraid if people knew the truth, they might not read his book. And Michael told me the truth is that the entire holographic universe concept that he has written about was given to him in a telepathic download by the extraterrestrials who have been abducting him."
So I know that was kind of a crazy intro, some crazy music and crazy images, but this is a crazy topic here. And it's been kind of a crazy week already, learning about the announcement of Trump's Space Force. And situations like that, what can you do but just have a laugh so that you don't just go insane just from the pure ridiculousness of it all. You know, it's like every time you get to the point where you think you've become accustomed to just the bizarro world that we live in, and then, sure enough, it just gets more and more surreal. I go, oh, it wasn't really serious, but then, I thought that was a good idea, so yeah, why not? Space Force. Like, you'd swear you were watching a satire of something. Like this is a character in a Mel Brooks film or something. But no, this is the president, and this is what we're doing now. The Space Force. Anyways, so as surreal as all that was, and obviously a lot of you were commenting and talking about how this might seem to indicate that indeed some kind of UFO disclosure or event is rapidly approaching, and so I've been thinking about that as well. We got to militarize space again, even though we have this treaty, and you're not allowed to put weapons in space, but forget the fact that Russians and Americans are living and working up in space, quote unquote, every day for the past however many years. We use their rockets to get up there. We're happily working and living together in harmony down in the Antarctic with that treaty, but speaking of American-Russian cooperation on the ISS and everything, recently apparently some of the astronauts, or cosmonauts for the Russians, they visited the Pope and presented him with his own special papal spacesuit, and talking about, the perspective that you get from space and how we're all one and blah, 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 blah. It's all about peace and global unity and the same old message. But, of course, we got to have a military in space because we're going to, for whatever reason. So the competing narratives, once more, who knows where that's even going to go. But yeah, the UFO deception obviously has been something that's been going on for a long time, and there's the whole UFO community. And so, after throwing together the Trump Space Force parody video thing, I came across this rather mind-blowing talk given by the well-known ufologist Linda Moulton Howe, and this is from a presentation she gave at last year's Contact in the Desert conference from 2017. I guess this year's conference just happened earlier this month, the beginning of June. And this Contact in the Desert conference, it's basically all the who's who of all the major UFO figureheads are there, from Eric von Daniken, Whitley Schreiber, George Norrie, David Wilcock, on and on and on. All the Ancient Aliens guys, all the people, plus like scores of people that I've never even heard of. So this is a big event. This is a big deal for the UFO community or whatever. And this talk that she gave at last year's conference was on simulation theory. And you guys, I gotta say, there is so much information in here that just combines virtually everything I've been digging into and exposing and connecting with cosmology and space being the spiritual realm and artificial intelligence and you name it. Quantum mysticism, the whole 9 yards. I think she touches upon every single thing, the New Age gospel at the end. It's all in here. So at first I was just kind of wondering if I should just play the whole thing, but then at the same time, I don't just want to mirror it and assume that people are going to know how to discern what I'm really trying to say or trying to expose in this. So I definitely think it calls for some commentary here, and there's so many points. She mentions at least 3 different figures, I think maybe even more. The first one being Talbot, the guy who wrote the holographic, the book on the holographic universe idea in 1991, or it was published in 1991. And she reveals that he got the whole idea for the book, for this holographic universe theory, from an abduction experience and having a psychic download and all that. So he got it straight from the demonic realm. Now, but that clip is actually in the middle of the presentation. And so for everyone who understands what is really at the core of the UFO deception, the alien deception, that this is demonic phenomena, this is a satanic agenda, these are fallen spiritual beings, they're not aliens, they're not from another galaxy or part of the universe, they're from the spiritual realm, deceiving people into New Age and occult belief systems. That should get your attention, to realize that the demons are teaching simulation theory. So it's a pretty long presentation, and she starts out just by kind of giving an overview of what simulation theory is, and she talks about the Matrix movies, and she talks about how mainstream science is now embracing this idea, and Elon Musk, of course, talks about it, and there was the debate or discussion involving Neil deGrasse Tyson and James Gates, who's that physicist who talks about how he found computer code within the fabric of the universe, and I played clips of that many times, and I'm sure most of you have seen that. And then she gets into this really wild account by this guy named Jim Wells, and he actually tells his story in his own words, and I think I'm going to play part of that, because speaking of the whole connection between space and the spiritual realm, once again, we see a perfect example of that. So Jim Wells is a guy who got involved because he had an abduction experience. He was taken on board what to him was a craft that was piloted by alien greys, and he was on a table and all that. So he had his abduction experience, and he got into the paranormal and the metaphysics, of course, just like Carolyn Hamlet says is the whole agenda. You have these experiences, and then you get pulled into, all the New Age stuff. And so as a result of that, he got involved with New Age spirituality, and he's down in South America visiting this shaman who takes him to this place called Amara Muru. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but it's this doorway that's carved into this rock near Lake Titicaca in Peru, and the shaman taught him how to chant at a certain vibration when he put his head against this door, and he has this crazy experience where he goes into quote-unquote outer space and has a conversation with an entity who basically tells him that the universe is a simulation and that we're in a computer program created by aliens who are themselves inside a simulation. It's the whole nested simulation concept, just like Nick Bostrom has been advocating. So the demons are teaching this. This is coming directly from demonic entities. This teaching. This is a doctrine of demons. And then as you listen to Linda Moulton Howe she goes on and on. She talks about quantum physics, and she talks about how consciousness creates reality, and how we're all put here in the simulation in order to learn how to reverse entropy. She talks about how what's wrong, there's these forces of violence and entropy, which is sort of the New Age version of describing the same thing that the Bible describes as the realities of sin and death in the world. So violence and entropy. And so, of course, the New Age idea is to learn to rid yourself of those influences of violence and entropy, and to work towards cooperation and love. And there's the cycles of reincarnation. And when you die, you go into other programs, other dimensions, other parallel universes. And then you come back, and then it's this upward cycle, the transcendence, the cycle of transcendence until you eventually reach godhood, which is unification with the source consciousness. I mean, it's the same old New Age message. But in this talk, she's giving multiple examples of people who are having UFO experiences, quote-unquote alien encounters, where the entities are absolutely teaching this concept. And what a coincidence, once again, that this was being taught before mainstream science started really embracing it. Before Neil deGrasse Tyson and Jason Silva and Elon Musk started popularizing it, before the Matrix films started popularizing it, this was a concept that was being spread within this New Age UFO community. Once again, that seems to be the formula, right? First, the ideas come through the occult sources, and then it's spread through science fiction, and then eventually heralded by the mainstream prophets of scientism. But in the truth community, it's amazing how many people are in lockstep with this whole narrative, with this whole, just the whole Matrix analogy in the truth movement is so pervasive that it's insane. And it just lends itself to then this New Age, essentially the whole point of the simulation hypothesis, in a nutshell, is to try and give a scientific spin, a scientific repackaging for the ancient ideas of magic. That's really all it is. Just like, the universe and aliens and all that is a way of repackaging and rebranding the quote-unquote gods who came down, the Watchers and all that, with like a science fiction spin. It's the same thing, to where now you're talking about the fabric of reality. What is reality? How does it all work? How's it put together? How can you manipulate it? How can you change it? How can we escape it? How can we evolve? How can we transcend? So it's just the same thing, this scientific spin of ancient occult ideas of how the world works, or the worlds, really. It's all about, and when you think about space in the sense of, if it plants one seed, it's the idea that there's more out there, right? That there's all these worlds and galaxies that are so far away, but they're alien to our own, and we, it's the desire to go explore and investigate and learn and spread out, and it's that pioneering spirit. But then, of course, the concept of physical space being millions of light years across and all that is rather prohibitive, so it necessitates really the idea of some sort of alternative way of exploring the cosmos. And that's when you get into the interdimensional approach and the metaphysics, right? With things like wormholes or things like remote viewing or just uploading your consciousness into a digitalized form or a non-physical form and being able to not be limited by time and space. So it all just always feeds back into this higher dimensional, spiritual, transhuman, new age angle, like every single time. So I'm going to play some excerpts and then maybe wrap it up at the end.
Another teacher in Jerry's life was a Peruvian shaman named Pedro, who was familiar with the Lake Titicaca doorway of Aramamuru. Pedro did not speak English, but through an Aymara translator, Jerry learned from Pedro that the solid rock doorway was a two-way passage between worlds and dimensions. Pedro told Jerry to kneel down and place his forehead in a small, shallow, indented place on the rock, and then to chant a specific tone over and over. After getting the tone absolutely right on a specific pitch, the doorway would open and the chanter would disappear into other realms. Also, Pedro told Jerry he had seen what he called ancient ones come through that doorway. And those beings were very tall, like Jerry's 6'9" and higher up to 7 feet. Those ancient ones were dressed in regal garments similar to Inca royalty. Pedro also knew that the tall ancient ones would kneel in front of the rock doorway and start singing with their forehead against the rock door and then suddenly disappear. Listening to Pedro, Jerry wanted so much to see and find out for himself, and by November 1998, right after his marriage to Kathy, the couple traveled to Lake Titicaca in Peru. At the Aramamuru doorway, Pedro taught Jerry Wills how to make 3 different tones that were always to be kept secret. If Jerry could produce the tones correctly, he would go through the big rock doorway to where the ancient ones came from. Jerry described for me what happened on November 11th, 1998, at 11 p.m. in the night, as he kneeled down before the rock doorway, with Kathy watching from a short distance away, and began to mimic the tones that Pedro had taught him. Jerry said the very first thing that happened is that it felt like he walked backwards straight off of a cliff, and that as he went off of the cliff, feeling this terrible clutch in his stomach and his chest, that he began to see stars and galaxies passing by as if he were in a protected bubble moving through the cosmos. And here now is Jerry Wills himself to describe what happened next.
And then it felt as though I was moving through something. I could sense that there was an impedance there. I squeezed my eyes closed because it was just so much pressure, and it was hard to breathe. And then suddenly, I find myself on this floor, I guess it's a floor. It was just a big white, everything was white. You couldn't tell if there was a wall to the floor, to the ceiling, nothing. There wasn't any curvature, there wasn't any distinguishing aspect. Everything was equally luminous. It was just like in a big white cloud. Like I could stomp the floor and feel it in my foot. It felt like plastic. I decided to try to see if there were any acoustic properties. So I started whistling, high notes, low notes. It just was dead. So then I started hollering, is anybody here? And it was just about the second time that I hollered that there was this voice, and it was like it was coming over an intercom. It was a man, and he sounded a little surprised. So I asked him, where am I? And he says, who are you? And so I said, well, I'm Jerry Wills. Where are you from? I said, well, I was at the doorway at Aramamuru. He says, I don't know what that is. I said, it's on the planet Earth in the southern hemisphere. And he says, oh, Earth, all right. I asked him what this place was. Where am I? Is this real? Am I really experiencing this? And he laughed, oh, it's very real. I understand your confusion. He said that I was on another world, that it was outside of my universe. So I wanted to understand how that's possible. And he says, well, there are many universes, and you have just passed from yours into ours. All right, so where is this universe? He said, it wouldn't do me any good to even try to explain it to you. I asked him how I'd gotten there. Well, apparently, these folks, whoever they are, had been very curious about the nature of the universe. In order to understand their universe, they tried to recreate, using what they knew, to recreate a model of the universe. But what had happened is that when they had recreated this, their creation had started to evolve. It had evolved up to a point to where it stopped growing. It was quite large, and that they had created another universe, and inadvertently. They weren't planning on doing this. And it had evolved, and it evolved quite rapidly. I said, well, I don't understand this, because we think the universe is billions and billions of years old. He says, well, where you are, you measure time much differently. Time is different in every universe. We've watched for the past, and he was struggling with terms that didn't make any sense to me. For him, it had been, let's say, a few decades. But within that universe that I had just come from, it was billions of years. Time was remarkably different for me than it was for him. He says, all right, you see that in the distance, probably 100 feet from me. He says, just walk towards that. It was this large, black, gelatinous-looking thing just floating in the air. You could see all these pinpoints of light. It was peppered with light in dark areas. And I said, what is this? And he says, that's the universe you came from. Well, this thing, it had these rods that were luminous, like neon. There was little beads of light moving through them, kind of like a fluorescent bulb, overhead fluorescent that gets bad and has like little dark areas moving through it.
I'm holding in my hand the illustration that you emailed to me. You are the figure in the foreground.
Right, about 100 feet away from that thing.
Did you get communication from the male voice about what the rods are doing with this gelatinous cosmic mass?
Well, the rods were around its perimeter. Didn't even look like they were connected to anything. I said, these light rods, what's that? And he says, well, that holds it in place. It maintains the balance. And we think that's the reason why it stopped evolving.
So did they deliberately try to stop the evolution of this universe?
I think so. When he was telling me about this, they were really very afraid that it was going to continue growing and it would just overwhelm them, and then what would happen to them?
So they're in another universe, and they created in this other universe a laboratory universe to test or learn something. And then their laboratory test universe took off somehow and created the universe that you and I and everything in our universe is?
He had told me that they were trying to understand their place within their universe, and that what they had discovered is that they were inside of someone else's universe, just like we were inside of theirs. He says it's just layers and layers. There's very little that separates one from the other. And that's what they had learned.
This 13.9 billion light-year universe, from our point of view, is inside of the voice in the all-white room universe, and that universe is in another universe. It's like you're describing those Russian dolls that all fit inside of each other.
It's just like Russian dolls. I said, what kind of machine would you use to do this? He tried to explain it. The closest thing that I can explain was what we call the Large Hadron Collider, a big thing over in Europe. This voice, he was talking about how they were colliding particles, and somehow a spark had occurred, and the spark didn't go away. Instead, it started growing. And as it grew, it started accumulating and creating more of itself on its own. He says, think of it maybe as a white hole. Think of it as a place where all of creation manifests itself within these torrents of energy that are moving both inward and outward simultaneously.
How many of you have heard or read the book, The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot? Maybe half a dozen. Oh, I recommend this to all of you to read. The Holographic Universe was first released as a hardcover by HarperCollins in 1991. Around the same time, I spoke at a Midwest conference along with human abduction researcher Bud Hopkins. The new book by a young man only 38 years old, and its mind-blowing hypothesis that our universe was being projected by something else, maybe from another dimension, was the topic of many discussions at that 1991 conference. A holographic universe is one where all of the information that makes up our three-dimensional reality, plus the fourth dimension of time, is actually contained in a two-dimensional surface that is projecting what we conscious creatures see and move through as three-dimensional space-time. Think of that bank card that you might have in your purse or billfold, and when you do this, it can project up from the card. It projects up because of the relationship of math and construction and photons. After the conference, Bud and I had the same airline flight back east to New York and Philadelphia, where I lived at the time. Bud and I sat next to each other to talk about some new abduction cases, and he surprised me when he said, quote, "I'll tell you something confidentially. Michael Talbot has been one of my UFO abduction cases, but he doesn't know anyone he has not told anyone, and he does not want anyone to know that because he's afraid if people knew the truth, they might not read his book. And Michael told me the truth is that the entire holographic universe concept that he has written about was given to him in a telepathic download by the extraterrestrials who have been abducting him," close quote. Sadly, Michael Talbot died a year later at age 39 from lymphocytic leukemia. And then Bud Hopkins died in 2011. So now in 2017, as there are increasing numbers of scientific papers and headlines asking these questions, are we living in a holographic universe created by a computer simulation? I think it's okay now to tell audiences about Michael Talbot's abduction secret, and hope if you have not read his 1999 book, The Holographic Universe, that you will read it, as more and more scientists are right now, trying to figure out if this is a computer-simulated universe. Only 2 weeks ago, on January 30th, well, actually now it's longer than 2 weeks, but on January 30th, 2017, theoretical physicists and astrophysicists from the University of Southampton in the UK and the University of Waterloo in Canada and the University of Salento in Italy published in Physical Review letters, quote, "substantial evidence," close quote, that we are living in a holographic universe as non-human beings told Michael Talbot in the 1980s. And this is an illustration that the physicists used in their new paper formally entitled From Planck Data to Planck Era, Observational Tests of Holographic Cosmology. Time runs from the left to the right. The far left illustrates the very first holographic phase that the scientists think was the true beginning of this universe. Their first two gray ovals are small and blurry to illustrate their contention that space and time were not yet well defined. And then by the third oval of grays, whites, and blacks, the universe enters what the scientists call a geometric phase, which can then be described by mathematical equations such as Albert Einstein's general relativity from the early 20th century. Studying our universe's cosmic microwave background left over from the singularity when the universe erupted in the Big Bang, scientists have been able to detect large amounts of data, zeros and ones, embedded in the white noise or microwaves left over from the moment the universe exploded into this dimension and kept growing. Could it be that the spark of light that Jerry Wills was told about in that white lab room in November 1998 grew to be our universe? Studying that data in the cosmic microwave background, these modern Earth scientists were able to compare networks of features in the data to modern quantum field theory, and doing that, they found that some of the simplest quantum field theories can explain nearly all cosmological observations of the early universe. So in their new paper, they conclude that about 375,000 years after the universe's geometric phase in the third oval of this illustration, they begin to see what they call, quote, imprints of information, close quote, about that very early universe. And the scientists hypothesize that is when the development of star and galaxy structure began to evolve up to what we call the current time, which would be on the far right of this illustration, looking like the dark sky with galaxies in it. And Professor Kostas Skenderas of Mathematical Sciences at the University of Southampton, England, explains, quote, holography is a huge leap forward in the way we think about the structure and creation of this universe. Einstein's theory of general relativity explains almost everything large scale in the universe very well, but it starts to unravel when examining its origins and the mechanisms at the quantum levels. Scientists have been working for decades to combine Einstein's theory of gravity and quantum theory, and some believe the concept of a holographic universe has the potential to reconcile the two. Imagine that everything you see, feel, and hear in 3 dimensions, plus your perception of time, in fact, emanates from a flat, 2-dimensional field. The idea is similar to that of holograms at Disney World. However, he closes his quote, this time it is our entire universe that is encoded, close quote. And now we're full circle back to the original question. Is this a computer simulated universe? This physicist says enthusiastically, yes, we're in a computer simulated universe. Tom Campbell, born December 9th, 1944, says that he has now done more than 400 YouTube videos on that very question. Tom likes to call himself an applied physicist because he never finished his PhD in experimental nuclear physics at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He broke off from his university work to be a systems analyst with the Army Technical Intelligence in the Foreign Science and Technology Center, also in Charlottesville. It is now called the National Ground Intelligence Center. In 1972, Tom Campbell worked for Robert Monroe, the author of the 1971 groundbreaking book, Journeys Out of the Body. Tom Campbell helped Robert Monroe develop the HemiSync technology for teaching how to go out of body, which Monroe would use in his formal Monroe Institute that he finally established as a laboratory to study consciousness. Later, Tom Campbell worked for the Strategic Defense Initiative, known as SDI, in the Reagan administration, and for a group called Space and Missile Defense Agency. He got out of that in the mid-1990s after working for a decade. And then Tom Campbell retired from government assignments. but he has never stopped working on his conviction that this is a simulated universe by something projecting information from another dimension that caused the original digital Big Bang. Tom is a co-author on a new paper soon to be published entitled On Testing the Simulation Hypothesis. His colleagues are Caltech mathematician Uman Awadi in Pasadena, physicist Joe Savageau from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, also in Pasadena, and David Watkinson, who produces digital animation of virtual reality simulations in Hollywood studios. Tom Campbell's concept behind this new simulation paper is that our entire universe was simulated by some intelligence to be an entropy reduction trainer for souls. This, if we could go to this next image. This has always meant a great deal to me since I started going to England and investigating crop formations in 1992. This is a spiral labyrinth cut in granite and limestone in Western Europe. And this represents the cyclic renewal of life, the great round of death and rebirth, the journey of the soul in and out of past, present, and future forms. These labyrinths have been found carved on ancient rocks in England, Ireland, the Adriatic Sea region, Hopi Indian lands, Greece, and the island of Crete, dating back at least 4,000 years before Christ. The spiral labyrinth represents the cyclic and the cycles of life. And in my own existence, some of the most dramatic experiences of my life have taught me that everything we see on the surface of the matter world has below it pulsing light. It is a truth to me. It appears that it is beginning to evolve out of physics, that this universe is simulated, and the question we all must try to come to some deep understanding with is who made it and why, and is Tom Campbell correct? Is this an entropy reduction trainer for our souls?